In last week's video, we tested the Sony Alpha 1 against the A7C Mark II and the A7CR for astrophotography. Surprisingly, the Sony Alpha 1 performed the best, and maybe not so surprisingly, the Sony A7CR struggled the most in these extreme low light conditions. But what if we took these cameras into more reasonable lighting situations? How would they perform? So after our second night of Milky Way, I slept through most of the day before heading out to Trillium Lake for sunset. Alright everybody, welcome back to the beautiful and iconic Trillium Lake here in Oregon. And we're out here at sunset hoping to catch the last little bit of alpine glow light on Mount Hood. Now as a landscape photographer, you rarely see us out in kind of like that midday lighting conditions where the light is super harsh and you've got clear blue skies up ahead of you. We typically like to come out during sunrise and sunset when the light is a little bit more softer and subdued. So we're out here today hoping to capture the last little bit of sunlight on the side of Mount Hood just to get a little bit of that alpine glow, similarly to how we captured it yesterday for sunset. But I really wanted to try and use all three of these cameras with ideally the same focal length to really test out how each of them perform. Before we get into the rest of this video, there's some eagles that are diving for fish, so I'm gonna try to see if we can get a shot of them. I don't have my wildlife settings dialed in at all though, but if there is one reason to keep the A1, it's for this opportunistic wildlife photography that sometimes happens when you're out in scenic places. I saw the eagles earlier, but I didn't think that they're gonna actually like come down and like swoop and try to like pick something out. So I saw it swoop and try to fish for something, but I missed the shot because I was not ready for it like at all. Now we did get a shot similar to how we are tonight. Actually, I think a little bit better than how we are gonna get tonight at Lost Lake, but I was shooting a time lapse with the 50mm and the A7CR, and I don't have an equivalent lens to do this test with. So to kind of solve that problem, we got the A7CR time-lapsing with the 16-35, and then right above it we've got the A7CR with the 20-70mm at 35mm. So we'll be able to get pretty similar shots. You know, it is different lenses, but there were Sony lenses that were made approximately around the same time, so I don't think the image quality is going to be that different. But if you had to ask me which camera I would predict to be the best for just this type of scene, I would say probably the A7CR. And the reason is because this scene doesn't have a whole lot of dynamic range in it. Probably the lightest part of our frame is going to be the alpine glow on Mount Hood, but all of our shadows and our pine trees and stuff is all really soft and subdued. So when you have like a scene with not a whole lot of dynamic range, you can kind of just expose your image to make sure that you don't blow out your highlights, take your shot, and then you're good. But we'll be testing out these cameras once again for sunrise tomorrow in a more higher dynamic range scene at sunrise, where we will be shooting into the sun before we fly out of Portland and onto our next location. But yeah, I would expect the higher resolution camera to probably look the best from this test, but we'll see. Eagle, hang on before we get started here. So I think this kind of subtle glow is that's kind of the best we're gonna get. We definitely got better Alpine Glow last night. We'll see if that changes, but you know, I think we're gonna take our comparison shots here. Settings, 1/10 of a second, f/16, ISO 100. Just focus on the scene there. Power this camera down. Switch it out. Ugh, this is a process here just for a few test shots here, but we're gonna repeat the same thing with the A1 here. All right, there's our test shots. We'll see which ones come out the best. Uh-oh. My time lapse stopped because my SD card is full. Oh no, I just realized it a tad too late. What's the problem with time-lapsing with the A7CR is that your card space runs out so fast. Keep shooting, keep shooting. I wonder how much I missed. Ah, shoot. Okay, well, our time-lapse is going to look a little weird because we missed like 4 minutes where the camera was not taking any pictures because I ran out of SD card space. So yeah, I guess that is another factor into my decision, you know, when you're shooting with such a high resolution camera like the A7CR and you want to do a time lapse of a sunset. For this test I was shooting uncompressed RAW and was not really paying attention to my time lapse, and I only have a 256 gigabyte card. I was doing 2-second intervals and I ran out of SD card space before, you know, the whole sunset was over. So something to keep in mind if I do decide to switch to the A7CR is that, you know, we're gonna have to get bigger V90 cards and that's gonna be more expensive too. I already have 1 terabyte cards for my A1, so that's never really an issue for the A1, but I'm just gonna let this last little bit of light fade and head back home because we got an early start for tomorrow morning. Man. I think we could have slept in this morning. The weather report said clouds, but there really isn't a whole lot of clouds. We don't have a whole lot of fog either, but welcome back to John's Road. This is an overlook kind of close by Portland. I figured I have to drive from Hood River all the way down to Portland, so I might as well stop here for sunrise before we head to the airport. But yeah, it's a pretty bland view, not a whole lot going on. But we have to do one more test with our 3 cameras for landscape photography in particular. And you know, this is the place to do it. Might not be the best photographs that we get, but at least we'll be able to test how these sensors perform in terms of dynamic range, because the sun is going to be rising kind of right behind me. So we've got the sun rising off to the left, Mount Hood towards the right. We'll probably set up 1 time lapse to take this shot and then, you know, sprinkle in the camera testing here and there. I learned from my mistake yesterday by setting the A7CR up for a time lapse. I think today I'm going to be using the A7C Mark II just so I don't fill up the SD card. So right now this scene is still very much kind of blue hour-esque, and sometimes, you know, sometimes as landscape photographers we like to capture images during blue hour, so we're definitely going to try and take a test shot here just to test the dynamic range of all the sensors. Again, we've got 1 time lapse going with the 16-35. We zoomed into about 28 mil, and we're going to take our other test shots with the 20-70, so approximately the same focal length at 28 millimeters, but different lenses just for disclosure. But again, like I mentioned yesterday, these lenses were made by Sony approximately at the same time, so I don't think the image quality is going to be that far off in terms of, you know, what it's going to capture here. Take this guy off the camera and swap with the A1. All right, there we go. That's our blue hour shot. We'll see how these images look when we open them up in Lightroom and look at them in post. I would expect either the A1 or the A7C to perform the best in this situation because we have a lot of harsh dynamic range. The A1 actually performed the best, you know, during low light and Milky Way in terms of noise control. So I think with, you know, all of our really dark shadows in the frame here, I'm thinking the A1 probably will have an easier time recovering those shadows. But, you know, the A7CR might surprise me. You know, only time will tell. We'll just have to kind of wait and see. All right, so a little bit of an update. I just looked at what PhotoPills says, and according to PhotoPills, I don't think our sun is going to cross our mountains until about 5:40. My flight is at 8:20, and the airport's only half an hour away, but I don't want to feel like I'm rushing a whole lot. So I think once we get a little bit of the alpine glow in about 5 minutes, if we do get a little bit of alpine glow, then we'll probably just shoot through that. But in terms of taking a shot directly into the sun, I think we're gonna have to save that for our next leg of our trip, which is the South Oregon coast. We're gonna be flying into there today. But good thing this vlog has time to, you know, kind of get released. So we have time to film, you know, a section for that down in the Oregon coast. So yeah, I think I'm just gonna maybe pack up the rest of my equipment once the sun rises and kind of shines a little bit more light on Mount Hood. But yeah, I better head out before it gets too late and I'm rushing to the airport and all that. This view sure is something else, I tell you. This view is incredible. But this location, I'm not gonna lie, it's pretty gnarly. But welcome to our first sunset here on the Oregon coast. And we're up here on top of this rock, kind of shooting into the sun. We've got a lot of crashing waves and that's creating a lot of sea spray. So we have about half an hour till golden hour, and I wanted to try and see if we can capture a shot of all of these beautiful light rays that are kind of visible. You can kind of see them, but very faintly, you know, if you look out towards the islands. But we've got the sun setting right between the pine trees. I'm just waiting for that sun to cross between the big pine tree on the right side, and then all of the light rays should get more exaggerated. But yeah, we're gonna try to see if we can grab a quick shot here and finish up our test comparing all three of the cameras, because you know, if in Portland we were able to catch like a pretty nice sunrise, but we didn't stay fully until the sun rose up above the horizon. So I really wanted to test the dynamic range of each of these cameras and see which one performs best shooting into the sun, because I do that quite a bit, and I want to base my decision with, you know, all the factors involved. The astrophotography test that we did at Lost Lake, as well as, you know, the sunset shot that we took at Trillium Lake facing away from the sun, and now combine this with that shoot at Johns Rood, we'll be able to get an accurate representation of how each sensor renders all the variety of scenes that we can shoot as a landscape photographer. Yeah, I ain't taking no chances trying to use the A1 in this situation here. I'm only gonna do it for the test once I get my settings dialed in, but for everything else, we're gonna use the A7C Mark II. So just for this test, we're not gonna really do anything too crazy. We're just gonna take a single exposure. You can still see a lot of the light rays coming through the trees. And yeah, we'll take this shot, 1/40th of a second, f/16 ISO 100, uncompressed RAW for each, 2-second timer, mechanical shutter, I would hope. Yep. So there's that one, and we'll repeat this test with the A7 CR and the A1 as well. All right, got that guy. We did capture some beautiful images from this sunset here on the Oregon coast, but that will be a topic for next week's video. In the meantime, let's analyze the results from our little test. As with the last video, I'll provide a Google Drive download link in the description below so you can pixel peep these files to your heart's content. Just remember that they are my copyrighted images. Yeah, let's take a look at the shots that we took and kind of analyze the results and compare. Okay, so we opened up Lightroom and I've already kind of just done some basic adjustments to all of these images. We've got the A7CR on the left, A7C Mark II on the right. This is the test that probably surprised me the most. I was expecting for this shoot, because there wasn't a whole lot of dynamic range, that if I properly exposed the scene, I thought the A7CR was going to produce the best image. It was going to be the sharpest, it's going to have the most detail, even in the shadows, because there wasn't a whole lot of dynamic range going on. But to my surprise, if we zoom in here on our shadows, especially kind of down here by our pine trees, we are still getting a lot of that noise. And remember, we're going to have more noise because we have a more condensed sensor with 61 megapixels. So, you know, if we really didn't want to get all of the noise here in the shot, we would kind of just have to expose it for a little bit longer, but then we might end up blowing out our highlights. Like when we look at the highlights and we look at this mountain peak over here, you can kind of see the difference in resolution, especially if we look down here by these pine trees. If we zoom in really tight, you can maybe see the pine trees a little bit better. I don't know, in complete honesty, it's not that big of a difference. So yeah, and it's kind of disappointing that we have double the resolution, but I'm not really seeing a whole lot of benefit in compared to the A7CR. Really the only thing that I am noticing is that we're getting a lot more noise in our foreground here. But let's compare the A7CR to the Alpha 1. Again, we have the A7CR on the left, Alpha 1 on the right. If we zoom in, boom, you can already start to tell that we've got much more noise on the higher resolution camera, just as we mentioned before. But the A1, man, this area over here almost looks sharper than this area over here, which is interesting. And especially if we look up towards our mountain peaks here, yeah, the mountain peaks do, I don't know if we zoom, yeah, if we zoom in, it does seem like the A1 is just a little bit, tad bit sharper. If we compare the A1 to the A7C Mark II, let's see, this one we got the A1 on the left, A7C Mark II on the right. Let's zoom in here. I would say that these two cameras have pretty equitable amounts of like control over the noise and the shadows and then the dark areas. I'm not really noticing too much of a difference. Actually, maybe the A7C Mark II has a bit more noise over here than the A1. It seems the A1 seems to be controlling this area a little bit better. But in terms of sharpness, I would say that's, you know, it's about equal. The A7C even looks a little bit sharper than the A1, surprisingly. Maybe we have to think about switching, instead of switching the A1 to the A7CR, we should get a second A7C Mark II. So yeah, I was a little bit disappointed on this test with how the A7CR performed, you know, in a relatively flat situation, and you'll see it continue to struggle as we, you know, look at the other pictures that we took. So the following day we went for sunrise over here at Johns Rood, and we kind of we took some images during the blue hour. We've got the A7CR on the left and the A7C Mark II on the right. Let's take a look. So obviously the higher resolution sensor again is going to struggle a little bit more in these harsh lighting conditions. Look at how much noise is going on here in the frame. You can definitely see that, yes, Mount Hood does look a little bit sharper, I would say, in comparison to the A7C Mark II. But this extra sharpness is kind of outweighed by the fact that our shadows are so noisy in this crazy high dynamic range scene. I mean, this is a lot of noise going on right now. It's kind of borderline unusable, in my personal opinion. you can see the more natural colors of like green here on the with the A7C Mark II. With the A7CR, you're getting so much noise that that green is kind of being turned into like a little bit more like magenta, which is what you can get with, you know, noisy photographs, is that you end up getting more magenta cast in your shot. Let's compare the A1 to the A7C Mark II. It's pretty good. Yeah, you can definitely see the A7C Mark II is controlling the noise a lot better than the A1. Reasonable, but I mean the A1 still is a little bit closer to natural than the A7CR was, as you can tell. So there is just a very slight magenta cast from the noise, but it's not horrible. It's still pretty well controlled, I would say. Let's take a look at the shots that we took earlier on today here at Secret Beach on the South Oregon coast. This one we shot pretty much directly into the sun, you know, kind of right as golden hour was starting, so because I wanted to try and see if I could capture the most dynamic range. And I purposefully tried to overexpose this image to try and capture as much shadow detail. Plus there wasn't anything going on in the sky, so I figured I could blow out some of my highlights as well. Again, A7CR on the left, A7C Mark II on the right. Okay, let's take a look here. I'm not really noticing a whole lot of difference in this shot here. Probably because I exposed for the shadows and I didn't expose for the highlights. I was expecting the A7CR to perform a little worse, but it's actually not bad when you expose for the shadows. The A1 definitely has less noise going on for it. And because it has less noise, I think it kind of helps out with, you know, the overall image. Let's take a look at the shadow area here. Yeah, more noise on the A7CR as compared to the A1. A little bit better sharpness up here in the corner too. I think the A1 definitely just very slightly edges out the A7CR. You can still get pretty decent shadow detail with the A7CR if you expose for your shadows. But again, like you saw, when you expose for your shadows, you also end up blowing out your highlights. So if I were to get this camera, I probably would have to do like a lot more bracketing and exposure blending, which I will do from time to time, but it's not really what I want to do, I would say, because a lot of times I'll set this up on a time lapse, and time lapses we can't, you know, bracket and exposure blend and all that. So that's an issue. You know, for sure, I would say probably will return the A7CR. It was a good opportunity to test this camera, and it's amazing that Sony's able to put such a high resolution sensor in such a small body. But the thing that's holding this camera back is that I think that those 61 megapixels are so densely packed into that sensor that it really struggles in terms of dynamic range. It struggles to properly control all that noise in the shadows in a high dynamic range scene. It struggles in low light with noise. So for that reason, I probably won't pick up this camera or any of the other 61 megapixel cameras out there by Sony. Okay, next camera, the A7C Mark II. This camera really impressed me. I would say there was only one bad thing about the A7C Mark II, was that it was outperformed by the higher resolution A1 in low light. I was expecting the fact that this has kind of less dense pixels, that there'd be more light gathering and it would perform better in low light. But that, as you guys saw in last week's video, that wasn't the case. But in terms of regular landscape photography, this actually did a really good job and pretty much kept up to pace with the A1. And in some areas, it even outperformed the A1. Like the shots looked sharper, the shadows were a little bit more controlled when it came to noise. It's really got me thinking, if I get rid of the A1, I probably could get another A7C Mark II and just, you know, and just roll with two A7C Mark IIs. Like, it's quite impressive how well it performed throughout all the different tests. You know, it's, again, very, very impressive. Now, when it comes to the A1, this camera performed as good as I thought it would, because I've been shooting this with this camera for, you know, over a couple of years by now. I'm very aware with how impressive like the low level light performance is for Milky Way, as well as how well it performs for landscape photography. And this test just confirmed that the A1 still, it's kind of the best overall camera. I mean, it performed the best for astrophotography. It was pretty much just the same exact results as the A7C Mark II, despite it being at a higher resolution. There's a couple of things holding me back from actually pulling the trigger and getting rid of the A1 and getting another A7C Mark II. Number one was that one moment at Trillium Lake when we were shooting the bald eagles. I was immediately reaching for the A1 and I immediately put the 100 to 400 on and blasted away and actually got some pretty usable results from that shoot. And you know, having that 30 frames per second, having that continuous autofocus, that's super sticky. I mean, the A7C Mark II definitely can shoot some wildlife at 10 frames a second, and the autofocus with that new AI processing chip, I'm sure, probably would perform quite well. But there's nothing quite like firing off a burst of 30 frames per second at birds. And while I'm more of an opportunistic wildlife photographer than actually a wildlife photographer that goes out with intention to photograph birds, I would still say that having that higher resolution at 30 frames per second, it's very helpful and very clutch to have in those situations where you need it. And you know, the added benefit that there was like a really noticeable difference in noise when shooting Milky Way, and because I'm doing so much Milky Way nowadays, it's going to be hard for me to like justify getting rid of this, because I'll always know in the back of my mind that, you know, I could be capturing Milky Way a little bit better with the A1. Man, it just pains me to, you know, have to carry this guy around because, you know, the body itself is so much more heavier than the A7C Mark II. I mean, the A7C Mark II, again, it's like a toy. This guy is a beast. You know, it's heavy, no doubt. The caveat is if I'm shooting next to the edge of a cliff, if I'm shooting around water of any kind, salt water, fresh water, and whatnot, we'll switch to the A7C Mark II, because this camera was very impressive, and you know, the resolution and the detail and the noise control was very comparable to the A1. So if I don't need the speed and, you know, the risk of me losing a camera is relatively high, I could definitely see myself just saying, put the A1 back in the bag. We're gonna shoot with the A7C Mark II and, you know, get pretty similar results. And as well as situations where if I'm going out on a hike and I only want to take one camera body, I probably will leave the A1 at home and just bring the A7C Mark II, because it performs just as well as the A1 in most situations, except for extreme low light and astrophotography. And obviously 30 frames per second is better than 10 frames a second. But yeah, thus concludes our camera testing. This was a pretty exhaustive process. I don't think that I could see myself reviewing any more cameras. This is more so of just a test to figure out what exactly I need, and hopefully you guys also found it a little bit helpful in case you're deciding between any of these cameras for, you know, landscape and astrophotography. If you like this type of content, photography, travel, vacation, and a little bit of education, make sure you hit that like button, comment below, and subscribe for more videos just like this one. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next adventure. Peace out.